Okay, let's dive in. You've handed us this fascinating collection of sources, and today we're taking a deep dive into the Vietnam conflict.
Yeah.
This is a period that, fundamentally changed America, stretched across decades and 5 U.S. presidencies,
Right.
with direct U.S. involvement really prominent from 63 to 73, as your sources lay out.
Yeah, it's a massive topic.
Yeah.
And the material you've gathered, it really covers the waterfront, from the historical the key events
Mm-hmm.
through the strategic approaches and the constantly shifting political landscape, both in Vietnam and right here in the U.S.
Right.
Plus, it details the significant domestic impact the war had. It's all in there.
Exactly. So our goal with this deep dive is to cut through some of that density.
Okay.
We want to help you unpack the core narrative, maybe identify the major players, highlight those crucial turning points,
Yeah.
and really understand the different perspectives presented in these sources you've shared.
Sort of a guide through the material.
Think of it like that, yeah. A guide to navigating this complex history and pulling out the most important insights. We're covering roughly, 25 years here?
Roughly, yeah.
Specifically focusing on that core U.S. involvement window from 63 to 73, involving 5 different administrations.
It's a lot.
It is. All right, where do we start? Your sources really emphasize the deep roots of this conflict, don't they? Going back long before significant U.S. troops were on the ground.
Absolutely. Before the U.S. was, fully engaged militarily, your sources point out that France lost its grip on Vietnam.
Right, after that key battle, Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
Exactly. And it's striking to learn from your sources that by that point, the U.S. was already footing a huge part of France's bill.
I saw that figure, yeah. Financing about 80% of their war effort there.
80%. That's a key piece of context, I think, for understanding the path to later U.S. involvement. It wasn't out of nowhere.
No, definitely not.
And running through that early period is the figure of Ho Chi Minh.
The leader of the communists and the Viet Minh independence movement.
That's him.
So, following that French defeat, you get the 1954 Geneva Conference.
Right. And the agreement there was to temporarily divide Vietnam along the 17th parallel.
Temporarily.
Yeah, with the promise of a nationwide election in 1956 to unify the country. And Ho Chi Minh actually accepted this division.
Banking on that election happening, presumably?
Exactly. He was banking on winning it.
Okay, but here's where the sources reveal a crucial U.S. move. President Eisenhower refused to sign the Geneva Agreement.
Correct. And this decision, it was heavily influenced by a concept that really dominated U.S. foreign policy thinking back then.
The domino theory.
The domino theory. The fear was simple, wasn't it? If one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, like Vietnam,
Then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma.
maybe even India, they'd all topple one after another, like dominoes.
Hence the name.
Precisely.
So in the South, a pro-Western government took power in Saigon, led by Ngo Dinh Diem.
Right. And your sources spend quite a bit of time on the Ngo Dinh Diem regime.
They do.
The U.S. backed him, saw him as a strong nationalist, fiercely anti-communist.
But the sources offer a really telling description, don't they? Painting him as an aloof and aristocratic Catholic autocrat ruling over a nation of poor Buddhist peasants.
That quote really stands out. It highlights that inherent disconnect, a huge insight into the internal problems he faced right from the start.
And one of his most critical decisions, which the U.S. supported to prevent a likely Ho Chi Minh victory,
Was canceling those 1956 elections, the ones meant to unify the country.
Yeah, that solidified the division.
It did. And South Vietnam, it was a mess after years of war and colonial rule.
Right.
And while Eisenhower promised aid for reforms, the sources are pretty blunt. Reforms were extremely slow.
And most of the money went elsewhere.
4 out of every $5 sent went straight to the military, not social changes. That's what your material says.
And let's not forget John Foster Dulles creating SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization.
Yes, SEATO. The idea was a sort of NATO equivalent for Asia.
But the sources show it didn't really take off in the same way. Only the Philippine Republic, Thailand, and Pakistan signed up in 54.
Not exactly a broad coalition. Still, the U.S. pledged to prevent communist expansion and started sending military advisors.
To train South Vietnamese forces.
Right. That's the beginning of that direct military support role.
Okay, so given Diem's regime in the South and the country staying divided, opposition movements started to, formalize.
Exactly. The sources describe the formation of the Viet Cong, or VC, and their political arm, the National Liberation Front, the NLF, right there in South Vietnam.
And they were linked to Ho Chi Minh in the north.
Linked to the north, yes. Included former Viet Minh fighters and other groups who opposed Nungo Din Diem.
And they got outside support.
Supported by China and the Soviet Union, according to your sources, their stated goal is pretty simple: topple pro-American governments from power.
And they appealed to the population by promising economic reform, reunification.
And genuine independence.
Yeah.
Things Diem wasn't delivering.
The sources also note their tactics were brutal early on, assassinating 2,000 government officials just in 1960.
Yeah, it shows the intensity right from the start.
And that really is the point, according to the sources, where you see this escalating into what's essentially a civil war within Vietnam itself.
I think that's a fair assessment based on the material, yes.
Exactly. This takes us into the Kennedy administration. Kennedy inherits this very volatile situation.
He does.
And faces a critical decision point. Either cut ties with Diem or, well, double down on U.S. involvement.
And the sources show Kennedy chose the latter. He dramatically increased the U.S. military advisor presence.
From just 652 initially?
To a significant 16,000. That's a huge jump.
What was the thinking there?
The strategy seemed two-pronged.
Yeah.
Use U.S. technology and advisors to build up the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN,
Okay.
and hope that the increased U.S. presence would somehow pressure Diem into making those much-needed reforms.
Which, as we know, were still coming very slowly.
Painfully slowly, if at all, according to the descriptions.
And this brings us to the fall of Nungo Din Diem, a period marked by increasing turmoil in the South.
Right, and one event that truly captured world attention, highlighted in your sources, was the self-immolation of a Buddhist monk.
In protest of Diem's repression.
Yes, the sources say photos of this changed world opinion overnight. You can see why. It was incredibly powerful imagery.
Absolutely.
This widespread discontent, particularly among the Buddhist majority, fueled a coup by South Vietnamese generals.
On November 1st, 1963.
They overthrew and killed Diem. And your sources note this move was tacitly supported by U.S. as Ngo's corruption seen as a liability.
They saw him as ineffective, maybe even damaging the cause.
It seems that way. But what's incredibly poignant about the timing?
President Kennedy was assassinated just 3 weeks later.
3 weeks. It's startling.
It does leave that lingering question, doesn't it? The sources raise it, and historians still debate it today if Kennedy had lived.
Would he have eventually pulled the U.S. out of Vietnam?
We'll never know for sure.
We won't.
So moving forward, President Johnson takes the reins, and the sources capture his mindset with a very direct quote.
The one about not losing Southeast Asia like China.
That's it. I'm not going to be the president who saw SC Asia go the way China went. He was determined not to let Vietnam fall.
And he kept on key members of Kennedy's cabinet who influenced policy.
Right. The sources mentioned Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State.
A strong believer in the domino theory.
And Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense.
Who much later, in 1995, took personal responsibility for the war, didn't he?
He did, yes. A controversial figure.
So Johnson was clear. He wasn't interested in any settlement that didn't guarantee a non-communist South Vietnam.
Which leads directly to the pivotal Gulf of Tonkin Resolution.
Ah, yes. August 1964.
Johnson announces to the nation that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had made unprovoked attacks on 2 U.S. destroyers.
In international waters, he claimed.
Right. And Congress responded swiftly, overwhelmingly, passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution.
Which essentially gave Johnson broad authority to widen the war effort.
Without needing a formal declaration of war from Congress.
It was a huge grant of power.
Now, here's where your sources offer a really critical piece of information that came out later.
About the ships not being entirely innocent bystanders.
Exactly. It turns out those U.S. ships weren't just cruising. They were actively supporting South Vietnamese commando raids on North Vietnamese islands.
So the attacks, while they happened,
weren't exactly unprovoked in the way they were presented.
That context changes things significantly, doesn't it?
It does. Despite this, Johnson ordered limited retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval bases,
insisting he sought no wider war.
And he actually used the incident effectively in his 1964 presidential campaign. Made him look firm but restrained.
Clever politics, maybe. But the sources highlight a major point here. They suggest Johnson's significant error was using that resolution
as a blank check to escalate later.
Right. Without seeking broader buy-in or a formal war declaration, he seemingly wanted to keep decision-making tight, secretive.
Partly to protect his Great Society domestic programs, the sources suggest.
That's mentioned, yeah. And compounding this, a lack of trust with the Joint Chiefs meant military leaders were often left out of key policy decisions.
But the sources also add a nuance, don't they? At that specific moment after the Tonkin incident.
There's no evidence exists that LBJ intentionally sought to escalate the war beyond that limited retaliation. Not yet, anyway.
Okay. But the situation on the ground was unraveling.
Making the decision to escalate almost inevitable, it seems. Stabilizing South Vietnam, the original goal, was becoming less and less feasible.
And as the sources wisely observe, the deeper the U.S. got.
The harder it became to find a way out. It's a classic trap.
Military commanders pushed for more bombing, more troops.
And key advisors, even former President Eisenhower, were recommending escalation according to your materials.
The domino theory, though, may be less applicable given global shifts.
Like China turning inward during the Cultural Revolution or Soviet interest in negotiation.
Was continually cited as the reason for staying the course.
It was the dominant framework. Your sources point to what they label the fatal flaw in U.S. policy at this juncture.
Which was?
Johnson and his advisors considered escalation woo assurances that it would succeed. It was a huge gamble.
A leap of faith without a clear exit strategy or guarantee of success.
Exactly.
This brings us to Operation Rolling Thunder.
Triggered by a Viet Cong attack on a U.S. base at Pleiku in February 1965, 8 Americans died.
Right. And this was Johnson's fateful decision to escalate the war on March 2nd, 1965.
He ordered the first sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam.
Which would shockingly continue nonstop for 3 years.
3 years of bombing. The targets were military bases, roads, railways.
And critically, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That vital supply network running through Cambodia and Laos into South Vietnam.
But the sources reveal these massive bombing raids failed to cut off Vietnamese aid to the NLF.
So the bombing wasn't achieving its primary goal.
Apparently not. Meanwhile, the South Vietnamese army still suffered heavy losses from the Viet Cong, indicating the bombing wasn't shifting the tide on the ground either.
And hand in hand with the bombing came a massive increase in U.S. troops.
Huge increase, starting with just 2 Marine battalions landing at Da Nang in March 65.
The numbers exploded, from 184,000 troops in 1965 to a peak of 538,000 by 1968.
500,000 soldiers. And a key point from the sources here is that these increases in U.S. troop numbers
were matched by increased numbers of North Vietnamese soldiers fighting with the Viet Cong.
and increased aid from USSR and China. It became an escalating cycle.
An arms race in manpower and resources. The financial cost ballooned too.
Over $30 billion annually, the sources state.
Early on, the U.S. forces arriving had this sort of optimistic view, didn't they? That the war would be short.
Initially but falsely optimistic, is how your sources put it. But they make it clear they had greatly underestimated the sheer determination and resilience of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong.
It's powerful to remember Ho Chi Minh's chilling warning to the French, cited in your sources.
The one about casualties.
Yeah, you can kill 10 of my men to 1 of yours, but even at those odds, you will lose and I will win.
That speaks volumes about the mindset the U.S. was up against.
Leading the American military effort was General William C. Westmoreland.
The U.S. commander in Vietnam.
And the U.S. strategy involved 2 main components, the air war and the ground war.
Right. The air war was often preferred politically because it involved fewer American casualties.
And the scale is just staggering. By 1967, the U.S. had dropped more bombs on Vietnam
than the Allies used in all of World War II.
Incredible. But the Viet Cong adapted incredibly effectively.
Digging an estimated 30,000 miles of underground tunnels to move supplies, shelter troops, evade the bombing. It's amazing.
Wow. Then there's the ground war.
Relied heavily on search and destroy missions, the primary tactic to counter the Viet Cong's guerrilla warfare.
And Westmoreland was constantly pushing for more ground troops.
Believing he could win a war of attrition. Wear them down.
But as the sources point out, just finding the enemy was difficult.
The Viet Cong blended into the population, used the jungle, and the sources quote that famous line capturing the challenge: "The guerrilla wins if he does not lose. The conventional army loses if it does not win."
Meaning the U.S., as the conventional force, was inherently losing just by not winning decisively.
By definition, yes. The environment itself was a major challenge. Dense, humid, hot, hostile jungle terrain.
So Westmoreland's attrition strategy aimed to wear the enemy down by sheer body count.
Relying heavily on overwhelming firepower and chemical agents like napalm.
An incendiary weapon.
And Agent Orange, a defoliant designed to strip away the jungle cover. Controversial tactics.
Very. This contrasted sharply with the Viet Cong's advantages.
They knew the terrain and had much better peasant support. Local knowledge is key in guerrilla war.
There were also what were called pacification programs.
Yes, sometimes involving uprooting entire villages, moving people to cities. An effort to separate the Viet Cong from their support base, but often deeply disruptive and counterproductive.
And a notable statistic from the sources is the youth of the American soldier.
Average age in Vietnam was 19, compared to 26 in WWII, a very young fighting force, facing incredibly difficult conditions.
All these factors, the grinding strategy, the terrain, the enemy's resilience, the optimistic official narrative, were building towards
A moment that would fundamentally change the course of the war and public perception.
which brings us to the turning point, a moment your sources identify as the Tet Offensive in 1968.
Stating it was the beginning of the end to U.S. involvement in Vietnam, a critical assessment.
And this hit particularly hard because leading up to it, General Westmoreland and others had been suggesting
That the end of the war was coming into view, that the U.S. strategy was working, light at the end of the tunnel.
But then on the Vietnamese New Year, Tet, January 30th, 1968.
North Vietnam launched a massive coordinated strike. Some 67,000 Viet Cong fighters attacked 100 cities, bases, and embassy targets across South Vietnam.
Including a dramatic, though brief, attack on the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon itself.
Right into the heart of perceived American power. The offensive lasted about a month, with devastating casualties on both sides.
The key insight from your sources about Tet isn't just the military action, though. It's the outcome.
They state it was not militarily successful for Vietnam. They took heavy losses.
But psychologically destroyed American hopes. That's the crucial part.
Absolutely. The scale and coordination of the attacks, reaching into supposedly secure areas, it just shattered the narrative of imminent victory.
Exposed the idea that the enemy was on its last legs as, well, wishful thinking.
Or worse, deliberate misinformation.
As the reality of the war, especially after Tet, was vividly brought into American homes, critics of U.S. policy grew louder.
They didn't just emerge, they got much more organized. This period saw the rise of the New Left, largely centered on massive student protests.
On university campuses across the country, specifically focused on the war.
Right. Your sources note that groups like Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, became increasingly militant.
Used violence and turned to Lenin for its ideology.
And ultimately, the sources suggest, the New Left lost political influence after it abandoned its original commitment to democracy and nonviolence.
But the anti-war movement was much broader than just the New Left.
Oh, much broader. It really gained steam with the 1965 bombing escalation, and after Tet, the sentiment just explodes.
It drew in incredibly diverse groups, religious organizations, anti-nuclear activists.
Women's groups, civil rights leaders, all united in their opposition to the war for various reasons.
According to the sources, the single biggest cause for protest was the draft.
Yeah, conscription. What started as small educational teach-ins on campuses in '65.
Morphed into enormous public protests. Hundreds of thousands of people in cities like New York and San Francisco.
With those famous chants echoing, "Hell no, we won't go."
And directed at the president. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Very visceral.
Very. And the numbers being drafted were rising dramatically from 5,000 a month in '65 to 50,000 a month by 1967.
50,000 a month.
And a critical point the sources highlight is the inequality baked into the draft system initially.
The poor were twice as likely to be drafted as middle class.
Until the lottery system was introduced in 1970, supposedly making it more random.
Facing conscription into this deeply unpopular war, thousands of young men fled to Canada.
Or publicly burned their draft cards as acts of defiance. It was intense.
Beyond the draft, millions of Americans were also starting to feel the economic strain.
The pinch of war-induced inflation, as your sources call it. War costs money, and people felt it.
The role of the media during this time was huge, wasn't it?
Immense. For the first time, technology brought the brutality and reality of war directly into Americans' living rooms with very little censoring.
Your sources highlight the impact of CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite.
The most trusted man in America.
After visiting Vietnam following Tet, he delivered that famous on-air assessment.
Stating his view that the war was headed for a stalemate and the only rational way out is to negotiate.
And President Johnson's reaction, cited in your sources, is legendary.
If I've lost Walter, then it's over. I've lost Mr. Average Citizen. He understood the significance.
It's often seen as a turning point in media coverage and public opinion.
And editorials in major publications, even traditionally supportive ones like Newsweek, Time, The Wall Street Journal, started calling for negotiations too.
Military data, especially those body counts, used to measure success.
Were increasingly questioned. McNamara defended them as necessary for attrition warfare, but critics argued they were misleading in a guerrilla conflict.
Right. How do you count accurately? Who counts as enemy?
Exactly. The cumulative result of all this, the images, the reporting, the question stats, was a dramatic drop in public support.
It eventually plunged from 40% to 26%. That's a huge fall.
Massive. And Senator J. William Fulbright, head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, played a role too.
With those widely viewed televised hearings in 66 and 67.
Giving a platform to prominent commentators, many with anti-war views, further fueling public debate.
The sources conclude that, largely due to these factors, the public came to feel it had been lied to about the causes and winnability of the war.
That perception gap, that credibility gap became huge, significantly increased the number of anti-war voices, or doves.
Your sources helpfully clarified those terms that dominated the debate, hawks and doves.
Yeah, essential terminology for the era. Hawks defended the administration's policy, often framing it within Cold War containment.
The sources mention the John Birch Society as an example of a radical right organization combating perceived communist infiltration.
They even advocated impeachment of Earl Warren, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, for his liberal rulings. Shows the intensity on that side.
Doves, on the other hand, argued it was fundamentally a civil war the U.S. shouldn't be involved in.
They questioned the South Vietnamese government's legitimacy, opposed the bombings, chemical weapons, civilian killings.
Rejected the domino theory, pointed to U.S. losses, the economic cost.
Right. The sources note that most Americans probably weren't extreme hawks or doves.
But were simply disturbed by the war and protests, caught in the middle.
But the Tet Offensive dramatically shifted that middle ground. Remember those percentages.
Hawks dropped from 62% to 22% between January and March 1968.
While doves increased from 22% to 42%, a massive swing in just 2 months, driven by Tet.
This intense domestic turmoil wasn't just background noise. It directly impacted the 1968 election cycle.
Hugely. Johnson's approval rating plummeted. Robert McNamara's departure further eroded LBJ's confidence.
Then Democrat Eugene McCarthy launched his anti-war campaign.
Surprisingly gained significant traction in the New Hampshire primary, showing the depth of anti-war feeling within the Democratic Party.
Which encouraged Robert Kennedy to enter the race with his own anti-war platform in March.
The pressure on Johnson was immense.
And then came that dramatic announcement on March 31st, 1968.
Johnson, citing the divisions, the toll of the war, declared he would not seek re-election.
Your sources are unequivocal. Vietnam had claimed a presidency.
A stunning moment in a position your sources describe as similar to Humphrey's position on the core issue. Neither advocated immediate withdrawal.
Adding another layer was Governor George C. Wallace of Alabama.
Running on the American Independent Party ticket, he tapped into the fears generated by protesters and big government.
Advocated bombing North Vietnam back to the Stone Age, known for his pro-segregation stance.
A very divisive figure tapping into a specific vein of anger and resentment.
The result: Nixon wins the presidency. Narrowly in the popular vote, just 1% over Humphrey.
But a significant majority in the Electoral College. Congress remained Democratic, though.
Interestingly, the sources point out Nixon received 95% of the black vote. That seems counterintuitive with the Southern strategy. Correction. The source actually says Wallace received 95% of the black vote in some areas, which is highly unlikely and likely a misinterpretation or error in the source itself. Standard historical accounts show black voters overwhelmingly supported Humphrey. Let's stick to the core point about Nixon's win.
Acknowledging the likely error in the source note about the black vote. All right, let's focus on the main outcome. Nixon won, but the sources characterize him as a minority president with no clear mandate.
Owing his victory largely to the divisions caused by the war and protest against the unfair draft, crime, and rioting.
He inherited a deeply fractured nation.
So Nixon enters office in 1969, famously claiming he has a secret plan to end the war.
But your sources deliver a stark reality check. He didn't. He went on for 4 more years at the cost of thousands of American lives.
Oof. Nixon's approach is defined by the Nixon Doctrine and Vietnamization.
Right. The core idea was a gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Vietnam over time.
The plan was to provide South Vietnam with U.S. money, weapons, training, advice,
enabling their army, the ARVN, to take over the burden of fighting the Viet Cong Vietnamization.
The sources detail the dramatic troop reduction, from that peak of over 500,000 down to just 25,000 by 1973.
A significant drawdown. The broader principle behind the Nixon Doctrine was that, going forward, Asian nations and others would be expected to handle their own defense without massive U.S. ground forces.
But here's the critical paradox your sources highlight.
This strategy of withdrawing troops was coupled with
Expansion of the war by stepped-up bombing and ground attacks elsewhere in the region, like Cambodia.
exactly less visible ground troops, but still expanding the conflict secretly.
Despite the plan for withdrawal, protests continued. Doves wanted more.
They demanded withdrawal that was immediate, complete, unconditional, and irreversible now.
In October 1969, a massive protest. 2 million people across the U.S.
Huge demonstrations. Nixon responded with his televised appeal to the silent majority.
Those Americans, he believed, quietly supported his policies. But the sources note this appeal was divisive.
Yeah, he and Agnew verbally attacked the protesters and those who did not support the government's policies, including the media, sharpening the divide.
Then came the horrifying revelation of the My Lai massacre.
Occurred in '68, but only became public knowledge in '69. Lieutenant William Calley led a massacre of 350 unarmed civilians.
Horrific. Calley was court-martialed, convicted of murder, sentenced to life initially.
Though his sentence was later reduced, he claimed he was following orders. The public was outraged, the sources say.
Fueling protests involving hundreds of thousands added fuel to the fire.
Definitely. Meanwhile, official negotiations were happening in Paris, started back in '68.
Between the U.S.-backed Thieu government and the North Vietnam-supported Viet Cong.
But the initial positions were miles apart. U.S. wanted North Vietnamese out, Thieu stays. North Vietnam wanted U.S. out, coalition government, including Viet Cong. Deadlock.
Your sources reveal a crucial secret parallel effort, though.
Secretary of State Henry Kissinger holding secret negotiations directly with North Vietnam.
Kept hidden from the public, the press, even Nixon's own cabinet. Back channels.
Very secretive. Adding another layer of secrecy was what the sources called the secret war.
The bombing of Cambodia. Starting in March '69, Nixon ordered secret bombing campaigns there and in Laos and North Vietnam.
Targeting supply lines. The sources state this effort ultimately failed to cut off those routes.
And this bombing wasn't publicly revealed until 1973, years later.
Keeping secrets was a major part of the strategy.
Then, in April 1970, Nixon went on TV to announce a public escalation.
Sending U.S. troops into Cambodia to clear out communist forces, using it as a sanctuary and supply route.
Ignoring Cambodia's neutrality, he stated the invasion would be limited to 60 days.
But this public expansion sparked a new wave of intense protests, especially on campuses.
Leading to the most tragic incident at Kent State University in Ohio, May 3, 1970.
Students protesting the invasion burnt an ROTC building. The National Guard was called in.
And fired into the crowd, killing 4 students, identified by the sources as innocent bystanders, wounding 11 others.
Just shocking. And a week later, May 1970, a similar incident at Jackson State, an all-black college in Mississippi.
Rioting led to the National Guard being called out. Result: 2 dead, 12 wounded. Again, both dead described as innocent bystanders.
The impact of Kent State and Jackson State was immense. Several hundred colleges shut down due to student strikes.
Your sources state moderates joined radicals in the anti-war movement after this.
It crossed a line for many people. Congress reacted too.
Repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, removing that broad authority.
Symbolically important, though the war continued under other justifications. The sources note protests began to wane somewhat after this climax, though. Maybe exhaustion, maybe the troop withdrawals.
Then in 1971 came the bombshell of the Pentagon Papers.
Daniel Ellsberg, a former defense analyst, leaked classified government documents about the war during the Johnson years to the New York Times.
And these documents were highly revealing.
The sources state they revealed that the government had misled the Congress and the American people regarding its intentions, especially in the lead-up to major escalation.
A key insight highlighted. The primary reason for fighting was not to eliminate communism, but to avoid a humiliating defeat.
That quote is damning. And the sources explicitly state the Gulf of Tonkin truth revealed was part of these papers, the real story.
The Nixon White House tried to block publication.
But the Supreme Court ruled against the administration. Freedom of the press prevailed.
The result was yet another heavy blow to the government's credibility. The trust gap widened even more.
Definitely. Despite all this, the war continued. The sources note the South Vietnamese forces, the ARVN,
despite billions in U.S. training money, proved unable to defeat communists on their own. Vietnamization wasn't working as hoped.
American forces did withdraw from Cambodia in early '72, but the bombing campaigns intensified elsewhere.
Then, spring 1972, North Vietnamese forces launched a major offensive across the DMZ.
The Easter Offensive, now better equipped with foreign tanks.
Nixon responded dramatically in March '72. Massive bombing strikes against North Vietnam, mining its ports. A big escalation.
But interestingly, the sources point out, Nixon's recent diplomatic opening to China and the USSR seemed to pay off,
Neither retaliated significantly to this move. Détente had an impact.
potentially influencing North Vietnam to return to negotiations. The offensive was eventually halted.
This set the stage for the Paris peace talks to reopen in October 1972.
And the sources highlight a key shift in positions now. North Vietnam dropped its demand for a coalition government that would oust Thieu.
And the U.S. agreed to allow North Vietnamese troops to remain in the South after settlement. A major concession.
Huge. A draft agreement quickly emerged. Ceasefire, return of American POWs, withdrawal of all remaining U.S. forces.
With the 1972 presidential election approaching, Nixon was eager for a settlement.
And Henry Kissinger famously announced peace is at hand in November '72, just before the election.
Very convenient timing.
Indeed. However, the sources state the settlement then fell apart as Thieu wouldn't sign the treaty.
The South Vietnamese president balked, worried about North Vietnamese troops staying. Felt abandoned.
Understandably, perhaps. This impasse led to the intense Christmas bombings in December 1972.
Nixon ordered massive bombing raids against Hanoi and Haiphong, described by the sources as the most massive bombing of the war.
Intense pressure on North Vietnam, and maybe a signal to Thieu of U.S. resolve. It seemed to work.
North Vietnam returned to Paris and agreed to essentially the same deal from October '72.
Resulting in the Paris Accords in January 1973.
The terms: North Vietnam retained control over large areas of the South, agreed to release U.S. POWs within 60 days.
And the U.S. committed to withdrawing all its forces after the POWs were released.
So you finally agreed to sign. Why?
Reportedly because Nixon promised him U.S. would back him if there was trouble in the future. A promise that, well...
That wouldn't be kept, especially with Watergate unfolding and Congress cutting aid.
Exactly. Nixon declared it peace with honor.
But critics cited in the sources argued with considerable pain
that the U.S. could have come to this agreement 4 years earlier, before thousands more died and billions more were spent. A harsh judgment.
On March 29, 1973, the very last American combat troops left South Vietnam.
An end of an era for the U.S. military presence.
But the peace, as the sources make clear, was short-lived. Fragile.
Very. The final outcome described is the fall of Saigon in April 1975.
North Vietnamese forces launched a final offensive. South Vietnam collapsed and surrendered.
Saigon was subsequently renamed Ho Chi Minh City, the final victory for the North.
The costs of this war, as laid out in your sources, were just devastating.
Truly staggering. The human cost for the United States: 58,000 Americans dead.
300,000 wounded. 2,583 listed as missing in action, MIAs.
And for Vietnam, the numbers are exponentially higher, almost incomprehensible. Over 2 million Vietnamese dead.
And an estimated 300,000 Vietnamese MIAs. The scale of loss is immense.
Financially, the war cost the U.S. $150 billion. Money, the sources note, was spent on the conflict rather than on social programs at home. Opportunity cost.
And beyond the tangible costs, the sources highlight a deep and lasting impact on the American psyche.
A large percentage of Americans came to distrust their government. That credibility gap became a chasm.
Only deepened by the Watergate scandal unfolding concurrently. A perfect storm of disillusionment.
Absolutely. Among the post-war changes noted, Nixon abolished the draft in 1973.
Establishing an all-volunteer military force, which we still have today.
Also, the 26th Amendment, ratified in 1971 during the war.
Lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. Tied directly to the draft, old enough to fight, old enough to vote.
Makes sense. Finally, the sources note President Clinton formally recognized Vietnam on July 11, 1995.
Normalizing relations 2 decades after the war's end. Closing a chapter, in a way.
A very long and painful chapter.
Wow. It's a journey through incredibly difficult history, isn't it? From that early French involvement and the division of the country, through the massive escalation under Johnson, driven by the domino theory, Tonkin.
The pivotal turning point of Tet that shattered assumptions.
The immense domestic upheaval, the anti-war movement.
The difficult politics of '68, RFK's death, Chicago.
And then the long, complex path to withdrawal under Nixon. Vietnamization. Secret actions.
Devastating revelations like Malay, the Pentagon Papers.
All culminating in the fall of Saigon. It's quite a narrative laid out in your sources.
It truly is. And looking at these sources you shared, you see so many powerful forces colliding. Political calculations, shifting strategies that didn't work.
Right, like attrition in a guerrilla war.
Exactly. The overwhelming domestic pressures from protests, changing public opinion, fueled by that unfiltered media coverage, and ultimately the unwavering determination and resilience of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. You really get a sense of that.
The sources give us that view into the different perspectives, too, the hawks versus doves.
Yeah, seeing it as a vital Cold War stand versus a tragic, unwarranted intervention.
And of course, the sources leave us grappling with those immense human and financial costs.
And that profound loss of trust in government. It lingers.
It's heavy material, and we really appreciate you sharing these sources with us, allowing us to take this deep dive with you.
It's crucial history to understand.
It really is a pivotal period that continues to resonate. So, to leave you with a thought to consider, building on everything we've just unpacked from these sources.
Okay.
Given the immense costs, both in lives and resources, and the ultimate outcome described in this material, the eventual communist victory despite decades of U.S. effort, what does this history suggest about the inherent challenges nations face when attempting to impose their will or a particular political outcome on a deeply motivated local population fighting on their own soil? A tough question.
And maybe how might understanding that fundamental challenge, illuminated so starkly by this example from your sources, inform your perspective on similar conflicts or interventions in the world today? Something to mull over.